And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Berit Jany, teaching associate professor of the Germanic and Slavic languages and literatures and the German lower division language coordinator at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Jany, who grew up in Dresden, has a PhD in German literature from Ohio State University and is going to be sharing more with us about the portrayal of religious minorities in fictional writing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Jany.
Thank you very much for the introductory words and also for organizing this series of talks. To give it the air of a cafe, I have my coffee mug right here, and I invite the audience to go pour themselves a cup of tea or coffee, and then let's get started on our excursion into German fictional writing. Just as a side note, coming from literary studies, I regret not being able to provide you with any insightful charts, diagrams, tables. Instead, I will provide you with plenty of text and the occasional book cover. Speaking of texts, we will see all texts in the German original with English translations, and I will only be reading the English translations. Unless the translator is listed underneath the text, all these English translations are provided by me. So we will begin with a short excerpt from the 1935 Rubatscher novel, Maria Veronica Rubatscher, Das lutherische Jockele, which is set in 16th century Tyrol. We're basically going in medias res, so right into the first book, and then we'll work our way to the Anabaptist thing from there. I went home, quote, I went home to my sick father at the Annaberg. There the brethren gathered in a home. This is what I saw and heard. They call each other brothers and sisters. They do not curse. They do not scold. They do not need defense and weapons. They not dresses that display worldly pomp and splendor. They do not feast or gorge. They do not appeal to the authorities, and they bear everything with patience and the Holy Spirit. I was convinced the early Christians had returned. End of quote. The protagonist, Jacob, Jockele is a diminutive of Jacob or Jacob, gives a messenger-like report of a secret gathering of Anabaptists, whereby he summarizes essential aspects of Anabaptist life and piety. Before he himself joins the group of brethren, he is fascinated by their exceptional conduct. This moment of witnessing seems quite genuine and authentic, with the use of dialect and simple peasant-like language, which of course becomes more visible in the German original. Through the perception of the young man, the narrative introduces chief characteristics of the group, namely its conformity to early Christianity, its sense of brotherhood, and its emphasis on the simple life, humility, and patience, as well as its non-resistant stance. In itself, it seems like a very sympathetic description of the 16th century Anabaptist movement. Rubatscher, an Austrian novelist and school teacher from the Tyrol area, rediscovered the story of 16th century Anabaptist persecution and migration within Europe, particularly from Tyrol over to Moravia and then further eastward, roughly 400 years after its historical occurrence. In her description of the early Anabaptists, she relies heavily on historical sources, especially Josef Beck's Die Geschichtsbücher der Wiederteil von Österreich-Ungarn, which is essentially their excerpts from the Hutterite Chronicles that Beck put together in 1883, and in which he emphasizes the brethren's experience of martyrdom and their notion of imitating Christ through suffering. Beck's depiction of Anabaptism clearly made an impression on Rubatscher and led to a respectful attitude with which she portrays the movement's religious experience in her historical novel. Now, one piece of information that helps us further understand the motivation for her Anabaptist portrayal in the novel is the fact that Rupertje was a member of the German-speaking minority in Italy. After the 1919 dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, she and other South Tyroleans found themselves living outside the newly born Austrian Republic as members of a German-speaking minority in the enlarged state of Italy. Rupertje developed an interest in the fate of the historical Anabaptists against the backdrop of the contemporary situation of ethnic Germans. So she identifies with the historical Anabaptists and perceives their fate as an ostracized community as representative of the German-speaking minority in the Italian province during the early 20th century. And this becomes particularly pronounced in an essay that she wrote in 1937, in which she describes the Radical Reformation. Quote, "The 16th century came with its bitter religious fighting. Overshadowed by all the horrors of bloody persecution, a divine new beginning blossomed here between Germanic and Roman elements, similar to that of the catacomb church. In the spirit of the Heiland, German bravery and fervent faith fought their last silent battle against foreign infiltration." End of quote. The Heiland, by the way, is a 9th century epic poem that marks an important link in the development of the German language and literature. So although Rupertje takes into account the Brethren's experience of persecution, of bloody persecution, and their establishment of an underground church or catacomb church, she fuses the group's fate with German patriotism, much to the liking of German National Socialists who were avid readers of her novel. Her representation of Anabaptism as a genuinely German folk movement battling against foreign elements echoes the nationalist sentiments after World War I and relates to the situation of ethnic Germans in northern Italy. The story of the young dairyman Jacob continues much like a martyr story, almost as if it was taken straight out of the Hutterite Chronicles. After he becomes a member of the Anabaptist group, he encounters persecution in form of imprisonment and galley slavery. And prior to his own persecution, Jacob's spiritual leader is imprisoned, tortured, and publicly burned. After 20 years of laboring on a battleship in the Mediterranean, Jacob escapes and returns to Tyrol, where he spends the rest of his life in solitude and with spiritual reflection. Rupertje blends Anabaptist martyr rhetoric with what is later termed Blut und Boden, or blood and soil ideology. The Anabaptist protagonist's physical traits epitomize the Nordic type claimed as the master race by the German race theorists. Referred to as der blonde Ries, the blonde giant, Jacob is described as young, healthy, and strong-minded. He represents the simple rural life in the of the Tyrolean people. And Anabaptist migration to Moravia is depicted as support for Germany's colonization effort. Quote, "No torture and no torment can deter these courageous people from their path. And so they finally become the bearers of the German colonization in the far-off lands of the Slavs," end of quote. Anabaptism, their migration eastward, is depicted as a highly respectable folk movement that is intrinsically German. The protagonist is described as a German hero who combines national spirit with radical Reformed faith. Das lutherische Jockele is only one of several examples in which we encounter the Anabaptists in German fictional writing that employs the early movement, its commitment to certain theological and ethical aspects, separation from society, and non-resistance. And to make this clear, my focus this hour and my overall research is the way and also the reasons for why Anabaptists received attention in creative works written by non-Anabaptist writers in German-speaking areas, where the movement had originated. I'm aware of the current discourse in Mennonite and Anabaptist literary studies in North America, especially the discussions on expanding the field to include writings of different genre and media by and about Anabaptists. I think that is fascinating, timely, and relevant research. When looking at European, especially German literary production, the question of by Anabaptists is less relevant. We almost always we exclusively really deal with non-Anabaptist authors, apart from a couple of Mennonite authors that have mostly done biographical accounts. In the larger collection of Anabaptist-themed Germanophone narratives, the so-called Münsterites, members of the apocalyptic Anabaptist theocracy in Münster in 1534-35, who decisively broke with the non-resistant doctrine, have appeared as literary theme with relative frequency, more recently in historical novels, as well as in theater dramas, music compositions, and even TV shows. I suppose that the violent element lends itself more easily to fictional treatment. However, the scope of my research is narrowed by consideration of mainline Anabaptism in Switzerland, South Germany, and Austria, and with an emphasis on fictional writing in form of historical narratives. I will refrain from giving you a concise overview of all the historical and fictional narratives within this research framework. That would go way beyond our time today. But I would like to point out some features that are utilized in historical fiction during the 19th and 20th centuries, in which we see an increase of Anabaptist characters and settings in German fiction. Robert Zacharias gives a definition of the Mennonite thing in his most recent monograph, Reading Mennonite Writing, a study in minor transnationalism. And there he defines the Mennonite thing as essentialized and decontextualized Mennonite identity markers that are readily commodified. So, for example, I don't know, head coverings, borscht, quills, Zwieback, maybe even some critical remarks about dancing. In German fiction, one could come up with the Anabaptist thing, focusing less on specific objects, but rather on orthopractic elements, such as nonconformity or separation from the secular realm, non-resistance, underground church, and persecution and suffering. And these elements are not used by authors to mark their Anabaptist affiliation. We already established most of these authors don't have an Anabaptist heritage, but to mark their characters in their novels as other, whether in a positive or a negative way. Depending on the author's familiarity with Anabaptist history, through either polemical and anti-Anabaptist writings or through the group's own historical narratives or Anabaptist sympathetic historical accounts, authors of fictional writing have either demonized or idealized Anabaptism for strategic and political purposes. The Anabaptist thing is less commodified than instrumentalized as a means of cloaking contemporary programmatic aims and ideological convictions of these respective authors. And the negative influence of Anabaptist phobic historical accounts on literary portrayals becomes particularly pronounced in Gottfried Keller's novella Ursula, published in 1877, in which the author depicts 16th century Zurich Anabaptism as a group of fanatical, irrational, and immoral human beings. In this story, the protagonist Hansli, a Swiss mercenary soldier, we can see him here in the front cover, returns from the Italian wars in 1523 and discovers that his home community had been infiltrated by the convictions of the Anabaptists. Even Ursula, his childhood love, and her family have converted to the sect and now exhibit a very peculiar conduct. The young woman, for example, is determined to become Hansli's wife without the blessing of the institutional church, much to the bewilderment of Hansli. Taking her home, he finds her father and his Anabaptist friends involved in an irrational conversation about chiliastic beliefs. The city council makes all effort to bring the Anabaptist movement under control and even arrests members of the group, including Ursula and her parents. Hoping to win her back from her father's religious fanaticism, Hansli liberates her and the other inmates from the prison tower, only to find Ursula in a deranged state. Giving up on her love, he joins the reformed troops in the Second Capel War, where he defends the reformed Swiss alliance. But then, eventually bewildered by the insane behavior of the Anabaptist community, Ursula regains her senses and reunites with Hansli after she saves his life on the battlefield. And yes, the connotations or the language used here, such as fanaticism and sectarian, is of course coming from the author himself. Throughout his novella, Keller alludes to some elements of the Anabaptist thing, in particular, the underground church that was, quote, preaching in the woods and dancing and practicing lechery, and the women are madder than the men, end of quote. Keller is pretty quick in giving reasons for the clandestine character of the church gatherings, namely not because of the state's persecution of these radical reformers, as we know from historical facts, but because they supposedly wanted to hide their sexual transgressions in these nocturnal gatherings, something that was often eluded by anti-Anabaptist polemicists. In the scene at the Ketzerturm, a tower or dungeons in which the Anabaptists were imprisoned and starved into submission, the author refers to the prisoners as having unleashed, quote, an uncanny clamor with their singing and shouting, which at times degenerated into a wildly audible howl of curses and cries, of fears and distress, lightning and thunder, misery, death and the devil, destruction and crushing, whereupon a song of victory sounded again. So Keller goes so far as to downplay and ridicule the state-sanctioned terror against the faith group, which was carried out in these prisons and under torture. Keller gained information about Swiss Anabaptists in Melchior Schuller's historical account, Taten und Sitten der Eidgenossen, which in turn is based on Johannes Kessler's anti-Anabaptist polemical Sabbatta. Keller had worked in the position as the cantonal secretary of Zurich, and as such, he wanted to create a literary monument to Zwingli's statesmanship during the Reformation. And therefore, he chose the Anabaptists for fictionalization as antagonists to the heroic main character, Hans, or Hansli, who fights side by side with Zwingli, who's proponent of the reformer, and who basically epitomizes Zwingli's notion of a new institutional church with the support of and supportive of the state. In his depiction of the Anabaptists, Keller also pursued the agenda of a liberal movement in 19th century Zurich that supported the modern idea of the constitutional state. Inspired by the notion of the Swiss nation, this movement advocated for the supremacy of the state's authority over that of the church. And hence, his fictional representation of Anabaptists becomes an expression of his personal position in debates on contemporary national and confessional issues. Interestingly, while Keller created a thoroughly negative image of Anabaptists for early Swiss Kulturkampf purposes, Kulturkampf is the conflict between the government and the Roman Catholic Church regarding state control in late 19th century. Only 6 years later, the German author Adolf Hausrath, under the pseudonym George Taylor, pens the historical novel Cludia, in which he gives a more sympathetic depiction of the Anabaptists, with yet the same or a similar aim of taking sides in the Kulturkampf. The novel is set in Southwest Germany during the 1560s, at a time in which the Palatinate Elector Frederick II was known for a more tolerant stance towards the Reformed denominations. This story is about a young woman called Lydia who falls in love with Paolo, a member of the conspiring Jesuit order. Lured into the forest by a fake letter, Lydia is chased by a band of terrifying men and later rescued by the Anabaptist called Werner, who in his separation from society knows the rural forestry area well. And in the end, it is also the Anabaptist and his stance on separation of church and state that initiates Paolo's reconsideration of the Catholic Church and eventually his commitment to a life with Lydia. Adolf Hausrath, a professor at the University of Heidelberg, gained much of his knowledge concerning the Anabaptist movement from contemporary research, chiefly that of Ludwig Keller. Ludwig, not Gottfried, is a German historian who vindicated Anabaptism in his writings and gave the initial impetus to a new historical approach to the movement, one in which he recognizes Anabaptism as a prime example of his vision of an ideal Christian brotherhood. So Hausrath too utilizes elements that are canonical for the portrayal of the 16th century movement. He taps, so to speak, into the Anabaptist thing, in particular, the separation from state and society, the underground church, and the persecution of radical reformers. And he employs these elements to support his position in the 19th century Kulturkampf. In his novel, the Anabaptist distances himself socially and spatially from the government, from the institutional church, from society at large. In a conversation, the Anabaptist explained that he fled the city and moved to a remote area to avoid the religious quarrels and constant changes of mandatory faith, for which the Palatinate area was well known at that time. And there in the remote area, he remains outside of the radar of secular and ecclesiastical authorities, and thus is neither obligated to attend church services nor to send his children to religious instructions by city pastors. His self-exclusion from society is on the one hand an act of nonconformity, and on the other hand, a form of self-protection. It is reported of ostracism and persecution that his brotherhood experiences through the city officials and church authorities. Perceived as radical religious dissenters, the Anabaptists in the novel are forced to establish an underground church and hold secret meetings. The author explains in the novel, quote, "In the persecuted and repressed Anabaptist community, silent messages, watchwords, and signs of identification and all kinds of secret messages were not uncommon," end of quote. The threat of persecution is also mentioned when a member of the Jesuit order, upon seeing the Anabaptist, thinks to himself, quote, "I will make sure the bailiff visits this area again," end of quote, implying to initiate another round of interrogations and potential persecution. The author creates an image of the Anabaptist as a persecuted outcast, as a victim of Catholic intrigues and manipulation of the local government. To be sure, Hausrath does not depict the Anabaptist entirely as a member of this persecuted group that is bearing the suffering and adheres to all the moral and ethical standards that we associate with the mainline movement. After all, Ludwig Keller, the German historian whose work influences Hausrath's novel, was also the state archivist in Münster, and as such, he conducted research about the Münsterites. Representing the radical movement as a whole, the Anabaptist in Hausrath's novel is described in terms of the polarized concepts of Münsterite immorality and Anabaptist ethical conduct. When Werner rescues Lydia from the ditch in which she had fallen and injured her foot in the forest. This ditch represents the purgatory-like pit from which he takes her back to the world above, almost like an act of salvation. His charitable action, however, is obscured by his sinful thoughts when carrying the girl back to town. Upon noticing the white hands and recalling the girl's innocent nature, Werner contemplates in form of an inner monologue. Quote, did not the rebel-rousers and Rothman and other prophets teach that if a brother feels that he has not yet found his spiritual wife, he should divorce the old snake and start a new matrimony? End of quote. So Rothman, the Anabaptist preacher during the Münster Rebellion, functions here as a metonym for the apocalyptic theocracy, and Werner's vocalized thoughts allude to the polygamous practice of the Westphalian group. However, Werner resists the temptations and counters the arguments of his alter ego by commenting on the fatal outcome of the Münster reign. In the end, he remains steadfast to his beliefs of, quote, his own brothers, end of quote. In this story, the Anabaptist also engages in a theological debate. During a conversation with Paolo's brother, the Anabaptist states his opinion regarding the sacraments. He addresses fundamental principles of Anabaptist theology. First, he criticizes the administering of the Lord's Supper by the Catholic Church and concludes that, quote, bread and wine are not enough. The Spirit must come from inside, end of quote. Here, Werner refers to the Anabaptist concept of communion as a spiritual act, and perhaps more importantly, he criticizes the way that the Catholic Church administers this ceremony. And he further comments on the Catholic practice of infant baptism and speaks disapprovingly of the Church's ritual of admission. Quote, you baptize the children who do not yet know what is good and evil, or what is yes and no. And then you claim they have renounced evil. That's how you start your cause based on falsehoods, end of quote. The Anabaptist later concludes that the juveniles shall not be admitted to the community of true believers until they gain full maturity and an inner conviction. Again, mirroring the theological precepts that we know from early Anabaptism. Throughout the novel's depiction of the Anabaptist as both a victim of Catholic authorities, but also a critical voice of Catholic influences and practices, it becomes noticeable that the author utilizes the historical material as a means of propagating anti-clericalism. Hausrath carefully employs Anabaptist doctrines that oppose practices of the Catholic Church to support his programmatic aim of promoting anti-Catholic and secularist notions. So to sum it up, all three writers, Robacher, Gottfried Keller, and Hausrath, select from a canon of chief principles of Anabaptist life and piety that create an image of the faith group supportive of their own political and ideological convictions. In the historical fiction, they construct an image of Anabaptism either as a questionable sect, as was the case of Gottfried Keller's novella, or as an idealized faith group that patiently endures pain as galley slaves and as persecuted people of faith. Drawing information about the early movement from historical accounts, writers become vulnerable to biased representation of Anabaptism in traditional historiography. With a rediscovery of the movement's own chronicles and revisionary Anabaptist historical research of the 20th century that re-examines and rehabilitates the early Anabaptist movement, a more sympathetic portrayals of Anabaptists occur in fictional writing by these non-Anabaptist authors of fiction. These writers recognize the separatist nature of Anabaptist theology and its practices, and they admire the faith group for imitatio Christi, that particularly in regards to the experience of persecution and martyrdom. So these authors represent and reimagine the historical movement in their novels. And they recruit the historical movement and utilize the Anabaptist thing, whether in a favorable or an unfavorable way, but always with a similar goal in mind, that is promoting their own confessional, national, and ideological objectives.